No one in the room expected silence to be the loudest thing that night. The studio lights were warm but unforgiving, casting a soft glow that made everything look gentle while exposing every truth that tried to hide beneath practiced smiles. Cameras hovered like quiet witnesses, red recording lights blinking steadily, capturing a moment that was never meant to become one. Keanu Reeves sat with his hands loosely folded, posture relaxed in a way that had always made people think he was unbothered, calm, untouched by the weight of attention. But those who truly knew him, those rare few, could see the tension held carefully behind his eyes, the way his breath slowed just a fraction too deliberately, as if he were preparing himself for something he could no longer delay. Across from him sat Alexandra Grant, composed, elegant, her expression thoughtful yet guarded. She had learned, over the years, how to sit with uncertainty without letting it unravel her. She believed in patience, in communication, in allowing people the space to find their words. Yet that night, something felt different. There was a subtle heaviness in the air, a sense that whatever was about to happen would not be easily undone. The host's question had been simple, almost careless in its delivery, the kind of question entertainment thrives on because it sounds harmless while carrying the power to cut deep. It wasn't accusatory, it wasn't cruel, it was framed as curiosity, the kind audiences loved, gentle, inviting, impossible to refuse. "Keanu," the host said with an easy smile, "people admire you not just for your work, but for who you are. They see you as someone who believes deeply in kindness, in love, in human connection. Is there something you've never said out loud, something you wish people understood about you?" A pause followed, not the awkward kind that comes from confusion, but the intentional kind, heavy, deliberate, full of meaning. Keanu didn't answer right away. The audience leaned in without realizing it. Alexandra felt her chest tighten slightly, though she couldn't explain why. She had heard him speak before, about grief, about loss, about humility. She knew his philosophy, his gentleness, his belief that love wasn't something to be rushed or forced into grand declarations. She trusted that steadiness. She had built her sense of safety around it. But this time, something was different. Keanu's gaze drifted downward for a moment, not in shame, but in reflection, as though he were searching through years of memories that had never been sorted out loud. When he finally looked up, his eyes didn't go to the host, they went to Alexandra. And in that moment she felt it, the shift, the quiet realization that whatever he was about to say was not meant for the cameras first, it was meant for her. "I've spent most of my life believing that silence was a form of respect," Keanu began, his voice calm, steady, unpolished in a way that made it feel real. "I believed that if I didn't speak too much, if I didn't explain myself, people would understand me through my actions. Sometimes that worked, sometimes it didn't." The room was still. Even the host stopped smiling. Alexandra kept her expression composed, but her hands tightened gently in her lap. She listened closely, not as an audience member, but as someone whose life had been woven into the spaces between his words. "There are things I've carried quietly," Keanu continued, "not because I was afraid to say them, but because I didn't want them to become noise. I didn't want them to be misunderstood or turned into something performative." His words were careful, respectful, deliberate. Nothing about them was reckless, and yet each sentence felt like a step closer to a truth that had been waiting far too long. Alexandra's mind drifted back through the years, not as a montage, but as sensations. Long conversations that stretched past midnight, moments of laughter that felt like relief rather than excitement, shared silences that once felt safe. She remembered how often he listened, how rarely he explained himself. She admired that about him. She had told herself that not all love needed constant reassurance, that understanding could exist without constant affirmation. But understanding, she realized now, also required courage. "I've lost people," Keanu said softly, the words not new, but still heavy. "And with every loss I learned to hold on tighter, to myself, to my thoughts. I told myself that if I loved quietly enough, I could protect the people around me from pain." The audience shifted uneasily. This was no longer an interview. It was a confession, unfolding in real time. Alexandra felt her throat tighten before she realized it was happening. She blinked, steadying herself, telling herself to stay composed, to listen fully before reacting. But something inside her was already breaking open, not painfully, but honestly. He turned slightly in his seat, facing her more directly now, though he still didn't reach out. This wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was something quieter, more vulnerable. "Alexandra," he said, speaking her name without performance, without theatrics. "You've always met me where I was. You never demanded explanations. You never asked me to be louder than I was ready to be." Her breath caught. "And I'm realizing now," he continued, "that your patience was not something I should have taken for granted. Silence, when shared without understanding, can still hurt." The words landed gently, but their weight was undeniable. Alexandra felt her tears well fully now, no longer something she could dismiss as emotion passing through. They were the kind of tears that come when something long unspoken finally finds its shape. She had never accused him, never demanded more than he could give, but she had felt it, the moments where she wondered if she was truly being let in, or simply standing respectfully at the edge of a door that remained closed. The host glanced nervously between them, aware now that this moment was no longer his to manage. Keanu's voice softened further, not weaker, but more honest. "This isn't about regret," he said. "It's about responsibility, about recognizing that kindness also means clarity, that humility doesn't mean disappearing, and that love, real love, deserves words, not just intentions." Alexandra pressed her lips together, a single tear slipping free despite her effort to hold it back. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She allowed it. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to be seen, too. The audience remained silent, not out of shock, but out of respect. They were witnessing something rare, a moment where emotional restraint gave way to emotional truth, without spectacle or blame. Keanu paused, as if giving her space, as if acknowledging that what he had said could not be undone or rushed past. "I don't want my silence to ever make you feel alone again," he finally said. "And I don't want my fear of being misunderstood to cost me the most honest connection I've ever had." Alexandra exhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling as she tried to ground herself in the present. She didn't speak yet, not because she couldn't, but because this moment deserved stillness before response. Her tears were not of devastation, they were of recognition, of the quiet understanding that something long buried had finally surfaced, and that whatever came next would require courage from both of them. And as the cameras continued to roll, capturing the fragile space between confession and response, one truth became clear to everyone watching. This was only the beginning. When the red lights finally switched off, and the studio applause faded into an uneasy quiet, the room felt smaller than it had moments before, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen and now refused to retreat. The host offered polite closing remarks, the crew began moving with rehearsed efficiency, and conversations resumed in hushed professional tones, yet something fragile lingered in the air, something unfinished that could not be packed away with cables and cameras. Keanu Reeves remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his posture unchanged, but his expression subtly altered, as though the weight he had carried silently for years had shifted forward onto his chest, no longer hidden behind calm restraint. Across from him, Alexandra Grant rose slowly, her movements deliberate, composed, betraying none of the emotional turbulence that still echoed within her. Yet her eyes told a different story, one of reflection colliding with vulnerability in a way that refused to be ignored. They did not speak immediately. That silence, unlike the ones Keanu had lived in for years, was no longer comfortable or protective. It was charged, full of meaning, heavy with words waiting to be shaped. As they walked down the narrow hallway toward the dressing rooms, the fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, casting elongated shadows on the walls that moved beside them like quiet witnesses. Alexandra felt her thoughts racing despite her outward calm, replaying his words over and over, not to dissect them, but to understand where they left her now.
She had spent so long honoring his quiet nature, interpreting his restraint as depth, his pauses as thoughtfulness, and now she was forced to confront the truth that understanding someone did not always mean being fully understood in return. Inside the private dressing room, the door closed gently behind them, muting the outside world and sealing them into a space where performance no longer mattered. Keanu stood near the door for a moment, hands loosely at his sides, his gaze unfocused, as though he were still adjusting to the idea that he had finally spoken something aloud that could not be retrieved. Alexandra moved toward the chair by the mirror, but did not sit, resting her hands on the back instead, grounding herself in the present. The silence stretched again, but this time it pressed harder, demanding acknowledgement. "What you said out there," Alexandra began, her voice calm but undeniably emotional. "It mattered." She paused, choosing her words carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for the gravity of the moment. "But it also changed something." Keanu nodded slowly, not defensive, not surprised, as if he had expected this reckoning and accepted it as necessary. He took a step forward, then stopped, leaving space between them that felt symbolic rather than accidental. "I know," he said quietly, "and I know I don't get to control how it lands." Alexandra finally turned to face him fully, her expression open but searching, a blend of compassion and resolve that revealed her inner conflict. "For a long time," she continued, "I told myself that loving someone like you meant learning to read what wasn't said. I believed that patience was enough, that understanding silence was a form of closeness, and in many ways it was." Her voice softened, but the words grew heavier. "But there were moments when I wondered if I was being trusted with your truth, or simply asked to wait for it indefinitely." Those words struck deeper than accusation ever could. Keanu felt them settle into him slowly, not as guilt, but as clarity. He realized then that his silence had not been neutral, it had shaped the relationship in ways he had never fully examined. "I never meant for my quiet to feel like distance," he replied, his voice steady but more vulnerable than before. "I thought I was protecting something fragile. I didn't realize I might be withholding something essential." Alexandra's eyes filled again, not with anger, but with the ache of recognition. "That's the hardest part," she said softly. "You didn't intend to hurt me, but intention doesn't erase impact." Outside the dressing room, the world had already begun its familiar pattern of speculation. Phones buzzed, headlines started forming, and interpretations multiplied rapidly, each one stripping nuance from a moment that had been deeply personal. Alexandra felt the weight of that inevitability pressing in, the knowledge that their private reckoning would soon be filtered through public perception. "Do you know what happens next?" she asked, not accusing, but weary. "People will turn your honesty into a story that doesn't belong to either of us." Keanu exhaled slowly, understanding settling in fully now. "That's what I've always feared," he admitted, "that speaking would make things louder than they needed to be." He looked at her directly, his gaze unwavering. "But staying silent made things quieter than they should have been." The room felt charged with the collision of two truths, neither canceling the other, both demanding space to coexist. Alexandra closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself before opening them again. "I don't need grand declarations. I never have. What I need is to know that when something matters, I'm not standing alone in the quiet." Keanu took another step forward, this time closing some of the space between them, not reaching for her, but meeting her presence fully. "I can't promise perfection," he said, his voice calm but firm, "but I can promise effort. I can promise honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, and I can promise that my silence won't be the place where our understanding gets lost." Alexandra studied him, not searching for reassurance, but for sincerity. She had always valued truth over comfort, and in this moment she saw both struggling to align. Then we're standing at crossroads, not because something is broken, but because something has been revealed. That realization hung between them, profound and unavoidable. Outside, the noise of the world continued, eager to label, to judge, to simplify. But inside that room, the real conflict was unfolding quietly, rooted not in scandal, but in growth. Alexandra knew that whatever came next would require more than patience. It would require courage from both of them, the courage to speak, to listen, and to accept that love, when stripped of illusion, demanded responsibility as much as tenderness. As they left the room together, not holding hands, not distant either, but walking side by side with a new awareness shaping each step, one thing was certain: the confession had not ended the story. It had only removed the veil, exposing truths that could either deepen their connection or test it in ways neither had fully prepared for. And somewhere between the quiet hallway and the noise waiting beyond it, the real challenge began. Not in what the world would say, but in how they would choose to move forward, now that silence was no longer an option.
The invitation arrived without ceremony, folded neatly into Keanu Reeves' schedule like just another obligation among many, yet the weight of it settled into him immediately, heavier than any premiere or award event ever had. It was a live, moderated conversation on empathy and accountability, streamed globally, framed as a discussion on how public figures navigate kindness in a judgment-driven world. Ordinarily, he would have accepted without hesitation, believing in the value of dialogue. But this time, the timing felt deliberate, almost fateful. He knew, even before reading the full details, that this would not be a space where silence could protect him. This would be a moment where reflection demanded form, where lessons learned in quiet solitude would be tested under unforgiving light. Sandra Bullock was listed as a participant. The knowledge stirred something complex inside him, a mixture of resolve and apprehension, not because he feared confrontation, but because he feared misalignment, the possibility of speaking before he was ready, of performing growth instead of embodying it. He spent days preparing, not with rehearsed answers or defensive strategies, but by revisiting the internal shifts that had occurred since that evening when Sandra had spoken her truth. He examined the ways he had begun to change, not dramatically, but intentionally, choosing presence over retreat, clarity over assumption, engagement over quiet distance. Yet even as he recognized these changes, he wondered whether they would hold when the world demanded proof. Sandra, too, approached the event with careful thought, aware that public spaces had a way of flattening nuance, of turning honest complexity into spectacle. She had agreed to participate not to revisit the past, but to reinforce a principle she believed deeply in, that respect was not about perfection, but about responsibility. She did not know what Keanu would say, and she did not try to predict it. Instead, she grounded herself in the belief that whatever unfolded would reveal something essential, not just about him, but about the broader conversation they were unintentionally shaping. The day of the event arrived with an almost deceptive calm. The studio was minimalist, designed to feel intimate despite the millions watching remotely. Soft lighting softened edges, and the moderator's tone was measured, respectful, intent on fostering conversation rather than conflict. Keanu sat upright but relaxed, hands resting openly, posture signaling readiness rather than defense. Sandra sat across from him, composed, attentive, her presence steady, neither guarded nor confrontational. The discussion began broadly, touching on themes of empathy, public perception, and the cost of being misunderstood. Keanu spoke thoughtfully, his words deliberate, acknowledging how easy it was to confuse intention with impact, how public narratives often simplified human complexity. Sandra expanded on the idea, emphasizing that growth required discomfort, that accountability was not an admission of failure, but a demonstration of integrity. Their exchange was balanced, reflective, and respectful, yet beneath the surface, a current of anticipation pulsed steadily. Then, the moderator asked the question that shifted everything, not sharply, not provocatively, but with the quiet precision of someone aware of its significance.
She asked Keanu what he had learned recently about himself that had changed the way he understood kindness. The studio seemed to still, as though even the equipment sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold. Keanu did not answer immediately. He took a breath, not for effect, but to center himself, to ensure that what he said next would be honest rather than polished. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a steadiness that came not from confidence, but from acceptance. He spoke about how he had always believed kindness meant not imposing, not demanding space in others' lives, and how he was now learning that restraint, when unexamined, could become absence. He acknowledged that silence, though often chosen to avoid harm, could inadvertently create it. He did not name Sandra at first, but the acknowledgement hovered unmistakably between them. Then he did something unexpected. He turned toward her, not dramatically, not with spectacle, but with intention, and he addressed her directly. He thanked her again, publicly this time, for her honesty, for trusting him enough to speak what was difficult. He acknowledged that her words had forced him to confront aspects of himself he had never scrutinized, and that he was grateful, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. There was no defensiveness in his tone, no attempt to soften the truth, only recognition. The reaction was immediate, though not explosive. The audience, both in studio and online, responded not with shock, but with a palpable shift in energy. This was not a public apology crafted for optics. It was a reflection shared openly, without self-pity or self-congratulation. Sandra listened, her expression unreadable at first, then subtly softening as she recognized the sincerity behind his words. When it was her turn to respond, she did not reclaim the moment or amplify the tension. Instead, she spoke with the calm clarity of someone who understood that accountability, once offered, did not require further justification. She acknowledged the courage it took to speak publicly about internal change, especially in a culture that often equated vulnerability with weakness. She made it clear that her intention was never to diminish Keanu, but to honor the humanity beneath the narrative that surrounded him. As the conversation continued, the focus broadened again, but something fundamental had already shifted. Viewers watching around the world were not witnessing a conflict resolved, but a process revealed. They were seeing what growth looked like in real time, not as a dramatic reversal, but as a series of conscious choices made visible. In the hours that followed, the response was unlike anything either of them had anticipated. Commentators struggled to categorize the exchange, unable to frame it as a scandal or triumph. Instead, people shared personal reflections, stories of times they had stayed silent when speaking might have mattered, of moments they had chosen intention over impact without realizing the cost. The narrative was no longer about two individuals, but a lesson many recognized as their own. Keanu, alone later that night, felt something unfamiliar yet grounding within him. Not relief, not closure, but alignment. For the first time, his internal values and external actions felt fully synchronized. He understood now that kindness was not a fixed trait, but a practice, one that required constant recalibration, humility, and courage. Sandra, reflecting on the day, felt a quiet affirmation, not because she had been validated, but because the conversation had transcended personal history and become something larger, something meaningful. She had spoken once in honesty, and that honesty had sparked movement rather than resistance. Yet even as the world processed what it had seen, neither of them believed the story was finished. Growth, after all, was not proven in words alone, but in what followed. And soon, an unexpected situation would arise, one that would demand action rather than reflection, presence rather than acknowledgement, testing whether the lessons learned under the spotlight would endure when no one was watching. As that moment approached, quietly but insistently, the question remained unresolved, lingering like a promise yet to be fulfilled. When kindness required courage instead of comfort, would he choose it, even if it cost him the safety of silence?
The moment that ultimately tested everything Keanu Reeves had come to understand about kindness did not arrive with cameras, applause, or expectation. which somehow made it far more demanding than any public reckoning he had faced before. It emerged quietly, unannounced, in a place where reputation held no value and silence would have been easy, even justified. He was traveling through a small coastal town for a low-key philanthropic visit, one of those commitments he rarely publicized, preferring to let impact exist without narrative. The schedule was modest, the setting informal, and the people involved were there not to celebrate him, but to address a lingering dispute within a community arts initiative struggling to survive internal fractures born of misunderstanding and quiet resentment. The tension in the room was immediately palpable, though no one raised their voice. Two organizers sat across from each other, both exhausted, both convinced the other had failed to listen, each interpreting restraint as dismissal. Volunteers lingered along the walls, hesitant, unsure whether their presence mattered at all. Keanu took in the scene slowly, recognizing something painfully familiar in the dynamic unfolding before him. This was not about resources or logistics. This was about silence, mistaken for indifference, about good intentions obscured by lack of clarity. In the past, he might have offered gentle encouragement and stepped back, believing neutrality preserved peace. But now, standing there, he felt the weight of the lessons he had learned pressing firmly against his chest. For a moment, instinct urged him toward restraint, toward the comfort of minimal involvement, the safety of saying just enough to be polite. But then, Sandra's words resurfaced, not as criticism, but as guidance, reminding him that kindness without presence could leave people stranded in their pain. He realized that this was not a moment for quiet approval or silent empathy. This was a moment that required engagement, even at the risk of discomfort. He stepped forward, not assertively, but decisively, and asked permission to speak, not as a benefactor or guest, but as someone willing to listen and respond honestly. His tone was calm, but clear, and as he began to speak, the room gradually stilled. He acknowledged each person had contributed, naming their frustrations without assigning blame, validating their experiences without diminishing anyone's role. Then, with gentle firmness, he addressed the silence that had grown between them, naming it not as malice, but as fear. The fear of saying the wrong thing, of making matters worse, of exposing vulnerability. What followed was not dramatic, but deeply human. One organizer admitted she had felt invisible, interpreting the other's quietness as dismissal. The other confessed he had believed staying silent was a way of avoiding conflict, unaware that it had caused harm instead. Keanu did not dominate the conversation. He guided it, asking questions that invited clarity rather than defense, encouraging acknowledgement over justification. For the first time, the people in the room felt seen not as obstacles, but as individuals navigating uncertainty the best way they knew how. As understanding slowly replaced tension, Keanu felt something settle within him, a quiet confirmation that growth, when genuine, revealed itself not in declarations, but in choices made when no one was watching. He did not leave the room feeling triumphant or praised. He left feeling aligned, aware that he had spoken not to be heard, but to ensure others were. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the town softened into dusk, he found himself reflecting on the unexpected completeness of the moment. There had been no audience, no headlines, no immediate validation, yet it felt more significant than any public acknowledgement he had received. For the first time, he understood that kindness was not simply about being gentle, but about being willing to stand in discomfort long enough for truth to surface. Sandra learned of the encounter days later through a quiet message, not detailed, not performative, but sincere. He did not frame it as a success or a lesson mastered. He framed it as an ongoing practice, one he was committed to continuing. Reading his words, she felt a sense of quiet peace, not because she had influenced change, but because change had taken root beyond conversation and into action. The honesty she had offered had not been wasted. It had become movement. When they spoke again, there was no need to revisit the past in detail. The space between them no longer carried unresolved weight.
Instead, it held mutual respect, grounded not in nostalgia or assumption, but in shared understanding. They spoke about work, about life, about the small choices that shaped larger outcomes. And in that conversation, there was ease, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was honest. In time, the world moved on, as it always did, carrying fragments of the story forward, while forgetting its quieter truths. But for those who had listened closely, who had recognized themselves in the silence and the courage it took to break it, something lingered. A reminder that kindness was not passive, that humility did not require disappearance, and that resilience was built not through avoidance, but through engagement. Keanu continued his work much as before, still reserved, still gentle, but now more present, more willing to speak when clarity mattered, to acknowledge impact alongside intention. Sandra continued to advocate for honesty wrapped in compassion, understanding that truth, when delivered with respect, had the power to heal rather than divide. And somewhere beyond public narrative and private reflection, a quiet lesson remained, waiting for anyone willing to hear it. That respect was not proven by how softly one spoke, but whether one chose to speak at all when silence risked harm. That kindness, when paired with courage, could transform not just relationships, but the people within them. In the end, the words Keanu never expected to hear did not break him, they shaped him. And in choosing to listen, to respond, and finally to act, he discovered that the truest form of kindness was not silence, but presence.